Okay, and welcome back. Um, the connections and Benjamin. This is kind of where we left off. As you can see, I cleaned this up a little bit from the last video. That's what you're going to see when you do access this. So don't worry about that little accidental formatting issue. Okay, so I'm going to continue with the reading as a whole. The Benjamin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Some terms that would be interesting to note, and by interesting I mean these are interesting to me, which they should be interesting to you. The preface in this has some references, at least in the copies, in the scans that you guys are looking at. I have the Marxist theory about structure and substructure or superstructure, et cetera, et cetera. I covered a little bit of this in terms of use value and useful versus useless in the class. I'm pretty sure we discussed it. This is just my way of reminding you that that was, I think, tied into other ideas that we've had before. I thought it tied actually pretty directly into the, how do we value things? What is the referent for value? In other words, if you recall, the example that I used was like I think a hammer. Like, well, how much does that hammer cost? What's the use value of it as a hammer? But what if it was the only hammer on the earth? Or then the value would go up, not because the materials have changed, not that you couldn't smelt one yourself, or what to smelt the metal, and you could theoretically gather those skills together and do it yourself. But the fact that it's the only one put together increases its value, so it moves it away from the material value. And what if it's like signed by, I don't know, just a famous person, famous do-it-yourselfer, and it was bidded on eBay. The value of that would go up, not because the hammer itself is more hammery, but just because the perception of its value goes up. That's a kind of a thumbnail, ham-handed way of saying that the further away from the use value you have, the uh, the 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 different perception of value you have to have. Okay, more abstract. So in the second sense, when I talked about art, this parallel between that and art, the theory is that if something is useful, the more useful it is, meaning the closer to that use value, perhaps, that you could get, um, the the less artistic it is, right? So if it's something functional, right? I don't know. I'm just looking around, and like this mouse, that's a tool, right? It has a certain, I bought it for like $7.99. But it's kind of artistic-y looking, but only in the sense that it's smooth and silver and stuff. They did that. I don't know why they did that, but I'm sure that some of it has to do with the fact that your fingers have to slide over it. But where does this, if I were to put this in a museum and say, this is a representation of, and I built this, right? And it's a representation of the 21st century, when we were all locked up in virus cell, against the virus. And this is the, thing I used. And I don't know. I just random things, right? So if I put it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, people would be looking at it like, ooh, what is the meaning of this, right? We're moving away from the use value into sort of a useless, quote unquote. And that's, it's, the quotes are a little bit a way to show it as sarcastic, I guess. Meaning, it's useless, but only because it's not useful 100%, right? Art hanging on a wall is not useful in the sense that you can't like hammer a nail. What's the action that you can take that can make those materials into something, something functional, right? You can actually just stand there and appreciate it. So the functionality of it is really the artistic representation, right? Which can't be quantified, right? In because we talked also about how art is subjective, right? Everybody's going to value it in different ways. So in a sense, its usefulness is not agreed to, right? So it's less useful and it's more useless, right? It's away from that use value. So that's a way to read that. And if I do reference the useful versus useless, it's going to be probably taking those terms and those ideas and then expanding on that, right? More than that, I probably won't tell you. I put some ideas here at the end. If you did read this, you know that one of the things that it talks about is how when art becomes more reproducible. He starts with print and lithography, but then he moves into photos and then film, and it's so the more these these signs of a particular thing, um, or its signifier, sign signifier is usually how it gets put together, is that one represents the actual thing itself, and then the other thing is like in this case, it shows you tree, right? Tree is just letters, right? If I were to look at it, if I were to look at this, right, that would be letters, right? And the only reason you know that this is not because this looks like this, right? It's not a picture of a picture of a tree. We can say, oh, that looks like a tree, even though it's not a tree. It is a picture of a tree, and it's as close an approximation of its visual, context that we would take it in nature. But this right here is just letters, and even if we didn't know how to read, that wouldn't look anything like a tree, right? That would be like lines, a couple of lines, and then some curvy shapes, and stuff like that. That's what it looks like. But yet we know that that represents tree, so it draws an image in our head. So that abstract, lettering becomes an image, something real. It's something close to real as we would perceive it. So that's a way of understanding that whole idea. And then, hopefully you're seeing how this can tie into these other ideas of useful versus useless. Something useful, something you can see and represent, and then other abstract notions that just sort of create value in our heads. Sorry about that. I won't edit that out, but that's just something that fell down for no particular reason. So the Benjamin stuff continues with the sections 2 to 4. I break this down into different components. If you did read it one time and it was very confusing, or even if you reread it one time and it's very confusing, look at these and you see how this breaks down. And this is just really a summary of the different aspects that it talks about. But then at the end, we have questions for development, although this could very easily just be questions for development. Should art be useful or useless, right? That's one larger question that we talked about. I introduced you to this poem, Ode to a Grecian Urn, and this references a visual image. It's an oldish poem. It's more of a romantic era poem. It references ancient pastorals and sort of Greek and classical culture, but that was a big romantic thing, and by romantic I mean like early 20th century, late 19th century, give or take. There was a poetic movement called Romanticism. I don't want to bore you with names or a history of that, but I did introduce you to one of these poems that references an urn. It's a pretty good poem if you're into that kind of thing. But it talks about beauty and truth, and how we can achieve truth through beauty. Beauty is truth, truth is beauty. That's all you need to know, and all you need to know on earth, and all ye need to know. That ancient ye, our good friend ye, that makes it very classical sounding. So this is a way of looking at the way art used to be seen before we were all postmoderny. So I end this on sort of a classical note because I think it's important to know that we used to think of art in many ways, at least in terms of this movement, as this higher plane of existence, right? We were in a state of sort of of understanding this beauty through art, this mystical line, above us, it's sort of like love. What is love? Love is everything, it's nothing. It's this thing floating above our heads. Beauty is this thing floating above our heads. When, a postmodernist would kind of look at it and say, take that apart, right? It's like, well, it's a neurological development, and beauty is really about symmetry and understanding how different cultures represent that symmetry. It's not very fun that way, right? But then that's the modernist sort of idea, right? Is that you need to take that apart, and there was a modernist movement right after this, not right after this, but, moving into this. about how reality should be taken apart, and examined, and the fractured state of the psyche is really, it's not this mystical realm, it's this understanding of the consciousness, right? And how it breaks stuff up, and we don't perceive what we perceive. And then the postmodern era, of course, is like it's the critical, not critical as in it's saying that it's bad. It's just taking it to the next step, saying, well, what is the meaning behind that? There is really no meaning behind that, and so we need to explore that meaninglessness through irony or other things. So that's a thumbnail sketch. That's probably not. I know it's not comprehensive, but it's at least interesting. That development you should understand when you're looking at these. So some of the reasons maybe why some of these are confusing at first is because you do have to understand that development, right? And so I've given you some ideas of that development as we go. The last thing that I want to do before I leave you on this one is to come back to, as I promised, the naked lunch in the last part. And this is some questions and some pretext that I set things up with for this particular section. So, in other words, what defines culture? What is allowed permissible and who defines? Next level, what is obscene? We discussed that a little bit with naked lunch stuff. But then I also referenced the First Amendment, right? This is sort of one of the two places where two or three places where I talked about the Constitution. Okay? So make sure that you're aware of that, and I will see you again in just a few. All right?